Hi, US kids. We're going to talk about the 1970s. So here's Gerald Ford. If my last PowerPoint, we talked about Nixon and the fall of Nixon. So Gerald Ford took the presidency that same day that Nixon resigned. But get this, he actually granted full pardon to Nixon. Remember the presidents have the power to pardon convicted people. So he pardoned Nixon, and his reasoning was that he didn't want to further damage the government because our nation was divided, and he wanted to heal us and have us come together and put the past behind us. But I'll tell you, man, there were people who wanted blood. They were like, man, that's so not cool. We want to see Nixon go to jail. But no, he ends up going free. So he was never held accountable for his actions. And going forward, Ford was trying to continue heading up the Republican Party, but the economy was starting to tank, and people blamed him for the loss of jobs and high inflation. So he did not win, and instead, this guy won. And this guy was Jimmy Carter, and he was an outsider to Washington, and he ran on a platform of wholesome Christian, honest values. He was a former peanut farmer out of Georgia. He'd only been governor in Georgia one term, so he didn't have a lot of experience. But people liked that. They liked that he was an outsider. President Trump ran on the same platform, the idea that I'm going to come to Washington and get rid of the people who are career officials. So Jimmy Carter was lacking in experience, and that definitely showed through his presidency. He and his advisors didn't really know how to tackle America's problems, and the problems were piling up. And most notably was the sad state of the economy. So the jobs were hard to come by, and people were not getting paid enough to afford the things they needed. When there's really, really high prices, but your paycheck doesn't cover the costs, that's called inflation. So the United States was in inflation, and that was rough on families because they just couldn't seem to pay their bills. So what was fueling that was fuel. There was problems with the price of oil, and the OPEC nations, the nations that produce oil, were completely jacking the price to screw with the United States. And America totally runs on oil. So when our oil is really expensive, it's hard for industries to do what they need to do. It's hard on transportation. And at the root of these rising oil prices was Iran. And if we go back to why is Iran mad at us, it's because we had given safe harbor to their former leader. This is the Shah of Iran. And in the 60s, we loved this guy because he would sell us oil, and he was totally for capitalism, and he didn't like communism. And he didn't particularly care if the people of Iran supported him, but he was a friend of America. Well, he gets ousted and overthrown in 1979 by this guy. This guy is the Ayatollah Khomeini, and he is a religious cleric. And so Iran was transformed into a very strict Muslim nation under his command. And they were mad at the United States influencing their country with democratic values, with capitalism, with our Western ideas, and they want to really get back to their roots of conservative fundamental Islam. So they see an opportunity to mess with the United States by jacking the price of oil. And so that is troubling for the United States. So I have this early memory of moving from Texas to Washington State, and in the middle of the night, our gas was stolen out of our cars, that there was such a gas crisis, an energy crisis in the United States, that people could come and siphon out the gasoline out of your car. And so I remember that we had left our cars sitting, which nowadays there's like locks on your gas cap because of that. So anyway, back to Iran. Iran is angry at the United States that we allowed the Shah to come into our country. Now, if he'd stayed in Iran, all of this religious fervor, they wanted to kill him. They liked Ayatollah Khomeini and they wanted to execute the former Shah. So we gave him exile here. Well, that further angers the Iranians, and they storm the U.S. Embassy in November of 79, and they capture 52 Americans, and they hold them as hostage, and they're paraded in front of the television cameras with their blindfolds, and every once in a while they would report on, are they getting food? Are they being roughed up? And we were really anxious about returning them home. We were worried that they were going to be killed. In 1980, President Carter organizes a secret military rescue, but sadly, it's unsuccessful. Two of the helicopters malfunction and another collides with a cargo plane, and they crash and people die. And those bodies of the American servicemen, I remember, were dragged around on TV, in front of the cameras as a way for the Iranians to show like, hey, we've got your American soldiers and this is what happens to you when you try and have these, secret rescue attempts. And so that further angered Iran. So Jimmy Carter is not handling the Iranian hostage crisis very well. It becomes very symbolic of two perceived trends in the world. One is the United States is no longer top dog, that other countries do not think we're as awesome as they used to think we were. So we are declining in our prestige. And the other thing that is a trend is there is this belief that our president and his advisors are incompetent and that they can't seem to do the job of government. And the American people are frustrated of not having a lot of money. So it definitely seems to add injury when President Carter tells the American people to just suck it up and maybe keep your houses a little colder and don't turn on the heat and just, dig down and have these hard times. And people were not really liking that advice. They wanted the federal government to have some stimulus, to give them some money to help. Other things that President Carter asked is that people conserve fuel by not driving very fast. I remember this 1980s big heavy metal, big hair video from Sammy Hagar called I Can't Drive 55, which you should search the YouTube and find it. It's hilarious. But yes, there was restrictions that you were not allowed to go faster than 55 miles an hour on the highways. And he created the Department of Energy to oversee our energy consumption. And he just really tried to put some measures in place for alternative energy so that we're not so dependent on oil. But Americans, again, it just doesn't seem to be enough. His approval ratings are really low. And then, oh my gosh, this is like the worst thing of his presidency, is that it just happens that the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan in 1979. And we have already been in Vietnam, so he tries to use a diplomatic, non-military response. And instead of fighting back in Afghanistan, he boycotts the Olympics because the Olympics were supposed to be in Moscow. So in 1980, all of our athletes who'd been training for years to go to the 1980 Olympics now can't go. So that was not a popular action of Carter. So it does not look like he is going to win a re-election. So the tide is turning towards new changes in the Republican Party. And the new changes were because society had really stretched to the left, that we'd had this counterculture challenging authority, that their values were not traditional values. the behavior of these hippies was really symbolic of all that's wrong with America. And there was some pushback to these new groups that wanted equality, like women and Latinos and Native Americans and homosexuals are coming out of the civil rights movement, also wanting rights and freedoms and have that guaranteed in the Constitution. But there were conservative Americans who felt that America's morality was slipping, and that with all the disco partying and the drug use and the increased divorces and national crime on the rise, that it's time to get our country back. And so a group is formed to help America find its way. And it was called the Moral Majority, and it was founded by a Christian pastor, Jerry Falwell. And they are going to focus on the traditional American values that America was founded on. They support traditional gender expectations. They support the banning of all forms of abortion, that they are uncomfortable with additional support for gay and lesbian rights, and that they want us to continue to fight the godless Soviet communists, and that we should be aggressive against the Soviet Union. The Moral Majority helped raise a ton of money for the Republican Party. And with this money, they hope that Republicans would support big business as they did with the laissez-faire government of the 1920s. So this big government would lower taxes and then allow businesses to make a lot of money, that there would be a balanced budget, that the government would be less involved in our lives, and that they would lessen the amount of money that they're giving to social welfare groups that were funded through the 1960s, and then continue to have our hard line against the communists in the Soviet Union. And that's definitely be our battle cry through the 1980s. So the poster boy of the 1980s is this man. This is Ronald Reagan, and he is going to run on a platform of the new right. He aligns himself with Christian conservatives, and he believes in an economic neoconservative policy called the trickle-down economics, and I'll talk about that in another PowerPoint. But there's a lot of groundswell to support Reagan, and not so much for Jimmy Carter. And so Reagan did some great campaign ads where he talked about how you're not better off with 4 years of Carter, and that that it's morning again in America. But look very carefully at this poster, in his campaign poster, that Reagan for president to make America great again. That was his slogan. So President Trump just took Reagan's slogan to kind of recycle it. So I just wanted to point that out, that this was the original president that was going to make America great again. And he had a landslide victory. Check that out. So that was 1980. Our next week of online learning, we're going to learn about the 1980s, about glasnost and our power positioning against the Soviet Union. We're going to have an arms race again. We're going to almost blow each other up with nuclear weapons. And so more of that to come. And I love the 1980s because those were my high school years. So we're going to do a culture project too. So take care, you guys. Bye.